All right. Well, good afternoon, everyone. I'm Travis Liska. I'm a principal planner here at the North Central Texas Council of Governments on the Sustainable Development Team, and I'll be introducing today's task force meeting. Just a little background, we're going to have several speakers this afternoon, so if you've got questions or preferences, you put those in the chat, and then of course we will open up the time to speak after each speaker. Everything you see today on the slides, we are going to be posting to our website and sharing with you all later. So if you don't get a chance to jot down information, that will be available later. And of course, the spirit of our task force and the reason we're hosting these meetings is to help local governments in the greater North Texas region coordinate on policies around land use and transportation and how those things work together. If you look at our long-range transportation plan at the Council of Governments, we emphasize the fact that we cannot build our way out of congestion. We've got to look at land use strategies along with our transportation strategies that help improve life in the region. And so this group convenes quarterly to share best practices among our cities. We're a region of over 170 local governments that somehow touch or influence transportation policies and implementation. And of course, we have like 50 cities that have a population over 25,000. And of course, that number has probably changed since I last looked at the demographics. So it's important we all share best practices with each other because we can learn and build a better region when we know more. All right, so let's go on to our next slide here, and I'll just remind everybody we meet quarterly. So if you miss one quarter, there's still great information coming the next quarter. So far this year, we've talked about zoning for multimodal transportation. We've talked about trail-oriented development. We've talked about strategies for expanding walkable places in North Texas. And those were our past meetings, which you can see the slides and details on them on our website. And of course, today we're here to talk about housing related to land use and the regulations and the various issues around that. Before we jump into that, Sydney, do we want to share our poll and just show everybody who's on the meeting here? Well, it looks like for those who've responded, we've got a lot of city government folks and a few others on the call. So thanks for filling out that information. And yeah, just to remind you, it's a diverse group and we're trying to share best practices among all of those folks. So what we'll do today is have a couple of speakers from some different municipalities give some local updates before we jump into our larger housing themed panel. And then I'll turn it over to Sean to introduce that housing panel. The local updates are meant to be quick, just bits of information on accomplishments, milestones, progress on recent projects that have happened around the region. And this afternoon, we have sort of a transit-oriented development theme to those local update speakers. And I believe the first on our agenda is from the city of Dallas. We have Pamela, who's talking about what has, I know, been years in the making to redevelop park and rides around the DART system. And they've recently, I believe, issued some RFPs. So I'll turn it over to Pamela to tell us a little bit more about that.
Thank you, Travis, and thank you for having me. Good afternoon, everyone. I'm Pamela Cifuentes with the City of Dallas Office of Economic Development. And today I'll give a brief update and background on the city's release of the request for proposals for transit-oriented development in partnership with DART. Can we go to the next slide, please? Okay, so the effort began in 2020 when the Dallas City Council issued a memorandum that's known as the 1,000 Unit Challenge. And the goal for this is to produce at least 1,000 units of mixed income housing that will serve between 30 to 120% of the area median income, to prioritize pedestrian-friendly connectivity, to reduce automobile congestion, make efficient use of our existing infrastructure, and then, of course, increase the tax base. So phase one of the challenge in December 2020 and January 2021 identified city-owned land that's within like half a mile of DART rail stations. So 5 sites were identified, and then the city released 5 RFPs in January of 2021. So proposals were received for 3 of those sites, and then the housing department has awarded and is working with the developers of those winning proposals. So then it brings us to December of 2021. So the city and DART formally memorialized the partnership through a memorandum of understanding. So in order for the city to issue mixed-use, mixed-income proposals for DART-owned land, this MOU also allows the city to negotiate an interlocal agreement with DART once we secure a development partner when the RFP concludes. The RFPs were just released in September 29th, so just a few weeks ago. And so there was 6 proposals for 6 sites, and I'll go over on the next slide that shows like a map of where these sites are located. So you can see, I'm trying to look at these on my phone. So it's for Royal Station, Westmoreland Station, Hampton Station, Lake June, Buckner, and 8th and Corinth. And I think that's all. I hope I didn't miss any. The pre-submission meetings are actually happening right now for these proposals. So there's 3 going on this afternoon, and then the next 3 will be going on tomorrow morning. And I encourage everyone to log in on the city's bonfire so you can take a look at, that's where the teams, the virtual meeting link for the pre-submissions are. The RFPs will stay open until the 16th of December. But yeah, if on the next slide, you can take a look at the a more close-up look of each of the station sites and the parking lots that we're hoping will be redeveloped into transit-oriented development. And with that, I think that's the end of my presentation. Again, thank you for having me, and then I encourage everyone to visit the city's procurement site to take a look at the RFPs, look at the criteria, and what the city will be evaluating for these.
Thanks, Pamela. Yeah, I'll definitely probably check out those RFPs too, because I am very interested to see how you guys are using this as an opportunity to advance, transit-oriented development there. And I know a lot of conversations have led up to this point in time to get those out there. So really exciting to see that. All right, well, let's look at another example of TOD happening in the northern end of the region in Plano. So we have Shanette here with the City of Plano to talk about what I think is probably the first transit-oriented development at Parker Road Station. So pretty exciting as well.
Great. Okay, thanks for having me, y'all. So let's go ahead and transition to the next. So you're correct, Travis, right? Okay, good deal. You're correct, Travis. This is the first one that's transit-oriented housing development happening at Parker Road Station. And honestly, when I think about the land around Parker Road Station, it's probably the most land right here. There isn't another spot. So what you're looking at is where the property is located. It has been vacant forever. I am from Plano, and I don't remember when there was ever anything on this lot. So the city has had a lot of, they thought about doing a lot of different things with this lot, and things have never come to fruition. This corner actually is part of the entryway into our downtown area, coming down K Avenue, going south, right, towards downtown. So it's an important corner that you see here. But where you see 2505K and 1005 East Park, that's where the location's going to be. I want you to pay close attention to where that rent-a-tire is. Can you go on to the next slide for me? Thanks. Oh. Okay, let's keep going. So this is how it's going to look. So what we're going to be building, and I'll talk about it a little more later in the actual slides. What we are building here is a 4% housing tax credit development where it's going to be 80-20. So 80% are going to be market rate units, and the other 20% are going to be, 80% are going to be affordable. The other 20% are going to be market rate. Can you go to the next slide? I think my slides are out of order. So, and Travis, I don't want you to keep going through it. So if you have questions at the end, we can go through it, but I'm going to go with the way I'm looking at the slides right now. So this is a better idea of what we get in the development. Okay, so it is a total of 226 units. When you're looking at it, I don't know if y'all can really see it, but 128 one bedrooms, 92 two bedrooms, and 6 3 bedrooms. There are not a lot of apartments here in our city that have 3 bedrooms. So it was good that we have that. And not only that, there's 3 bedrooms, but the idea that this development is for the general population. So there's no stipulations on it. Majority of our housing tax credit properties in Plano are for elderly. So the fact that this one is a general population is a really good thing. So can we go ahead and progress to the next slide? Okay. And so now we're going to get to the other side. When you saw that rendering before, the nice picture, there was a part of it that was an art park. So where the Rent-A-Tire is where an art park will be. So not only is it this project getting rid of vacant land that has been there, but there's an art park right there, making that corner be improved and just look better than what it is right now. So if y'all are wondering, go to the next slide for me. Let me see what's next. Okay, so if y'all are wondering, I'm going to get to the DART part now. But the project overall is about $35.8 million. I've already talked about the units. It's 5 stories. So parking's on that first floor. And then the residential units are on top from stories 2 through 5. And like we said, when the developer came in and did some estimates, they're estimating that this is going to increase DART's ridership by 100,000 riders every single year. So it's a good win-win for DART, but also for our residents as well. Go ahead, let's see what slide is next. Okay, we're going to continue on. So you can see 1.2 million are from housing tax credits, 1.6 are from the city's TIF fund. It's in a TIF zone, so we'll keep working on that. And then the important thing, and what really connects it to DART, is not just because it's on the other side of the Parker Road station, literally it's on the other side of it, but we are going to have walkways and connectors to the actual station. People will be able to go from their apartment, literally walk out and be at the DART station and not have to worry about crossing over rails or doing anything, because we're going to have the connector. Right now, we're still working on that agreement with DART. The developer isn't going to have to worry about doing any of that or putting that connector in, because the city's going to take care of it with our TERS funds. All right, let's see what slide is next. Okay, I'm finished. Thank you.
All right, that's very good points there, Jeanette, to talk about that unique project, and it's cool to see the art park, and glad to see Plano getting something on that site. And you mentioned something about not many multifamily developments being built with 3 bedrooms, which I'm sure many of our other city folks on this call could probably mention in their municipalities are not seeing many of those. So that family orientation, which really segues nicely into our topic of how do we diversify our housing stock here to ensure there's equal access. And so have Sean Conrad is on at the COG, and I'll turn it over to her to introduce today's focused topic. Oh, and while I'm at it, mentioning if you heard one of today's local updates and want to showcase something your city's doing, feel free to send us an email and get on the next task force local update. Thanks.
Hi, everybody. I'm Sean Conrad. I'm a principal transportation planner, also on the sustainable development team here at NCT COG, and I'm going to be giving a brief overview of housing and land use regulations in North Texas, just to set the stage for our segment and get speakers on this topic. So let's go to the next slide, please. The land use policies really govern things such as density, lot sizes, etc. Play a very large role in determining what types of housing options are available. Housing policies governing things such as allowable housing types and affordability are also really significant determining factors. So these are things that we look at when we're considering what types of housing options we have available. Where there's a lack of housing that fits with the needs of residents, a lack of choice in housing types, and lack of affordability, we can end up with longer commutes, higher housing and transportation costs, and also inequities in housing. So those are the kind of the unintended consequences that we end up with. By market demand, some land use and housing policies may ultimately prevent what's commonly called the missing middle housing. We'll talk about that more in a second. And as a result, have fewer housing choices that are available, or they may be less of a good fit for what residents actually need. Next slide, please. So missing middle housing is a term that has become fairly common that refers to housing types that fall on a spectrum between the most common housing offerings. So on one end of the spectrum, you have detached single family homes. You can see that in this image here. Some of you, this may be familiar to some of you, it's been used fairly often. So one end of the spectrum, you have detached single family homes. The other end of the spectrum, you have mid-rise apartments. Those are the most commonly offered housing types, but there is a very wide range of housing types that fall in between those two extremes. Duplexes, cottage courts, townhouses, triplexes, et cetera, et cetera. Another one that's not included on this graphic is accessory dwelling units, otherwise known as ADUs or granny flats. So just to set the stage as far as what we're talking about for missing middle housing. And this slide also has a pretty in-depth description of what each of these are if you want to refer to those later on. We'll go through this now. Next slide, please. Okay, we have a quick poll question here. We'd like to hear from you all about what experience you or your community have with implementing missing middle housing projects. Go ahead and zoom on over to that poll. We've got the QR code here, or you can use the link that we just inserted in the chat. Just give that a minute. Sydney, whenever you think we're ready, we can pull those over. Okay, we've got some that are experienced, some have some limited experience, and it's kind of across the board here. So that's good. Hopefully we can have a good exchange of information. Some people can pick up some tips on these things. So thank you for filling that out. Okay, next slide, please. So I just wanted to give you some idea of the regional housing picture. Probably not a surprise to most, the majority of the region is detached single-family homes, and the most multifamily housing is found in the most urban counties, which are Dallas and Tarrant. We also have, the ACS categorizes housing in its own way, and that doesn't necessarily match up with what we might think of as missing middle housing. However, we did look at a few statistics. Multifamily housing with up to 9 units represents about 40% of the total multifamily housing number. That you see here is 33%. In other words, it comprised 13% of the total units in the region. Multifamily housing up to 3 and 4 units, so those really much smaller units are multifamily housing types. That's only about 7% of the regional total units, and 22% of the total multifamily units in the region. So there's definitely less of a representation of sort of those smaller multifamily housing types. Next slide, please. As far as housing tenure, every county has more owner than renter occupied units, but Dallas County is almost 50-50 rented to own. Whereas rural counties have fewer rental opportunities generally. Likewise, this is probably what you might expect in our region, given the dominance of single-family homes in the area. Next slide, please. The regional median household income is close to 72,000. We've got a regional a gross median rent of about 1,000, and regional median monthly owner costs are about 1,700. Now, the monthly owner costs include mortgage, utilities, insurance, and taxes. And so if you look at the kind of standard rule of thumb in affordable housing, that housing is unaffordable if households are spending more than 30% of their income on housing plus utilities. At the median household income, that 30% monthly threshold would be about 1,793 for our region. Next slide, please. The range of monthly housing costs across the region is about 1,400 to 2,300, with several counties, including Collin, Rockwell, and Denton, having monthly owner costs and rents above the regional medians, and some of our more rural counties having lower monthly housing costs. Next slide, please. As far as land use regulation and policy, housing subdivision development often kind of drives and determines what types of street networks we end up with. COG has estimated that around 1,300 new subdivisions were built in between 2008 and 2018. So that's totaling about 142,000 new lots. So that's a lot of driving of networks. If you look at the graphic on the left compared to the right, and the one on your left is more sort of quote unquote conventional subdivision development with a hierarchical street grid. It exhibits low connectivity between destinations and neighboring subdivisions, kids being able to walk to school, that kind of thing. The one on the right has a much more connected street grid. And the hierarchical grid street grid system that you see on the left tends to keep housing separated from jobs and retail and other points, because it has limited points of entry and exit. There's cul-de-sacs where things end, and long block lengths, which doesn't tend to lend itself more to multimodal types of uses. Next slide, please. Also, as far as housing density and multimodal transportation, large lot sizes and setback requirements can create a challenge for transit and walkability. They essentially reduce density, farther to walk for pedestrians. Multifamily units might be restricted due to maximum dwelling units per acre requirements. Contrast, the minimum density for frequent local bus in a neighborhood is a rule of thumb, generally going to be around 15 dwelling units per acre. That really helps to support effective bus transit. Next slide, please. Also, highly separated jobs and housing might require longer commutes and then have a negative transportation impact. And so that's where you're seeing things like more vehicle miles traveled, peak congestion times, increased emissions from increased travel, and also, of course, increased cost, both of time and money, and both for housing costs and transportation costs. This can lead to an unequal dispersion of economic opportunity and put more of an onus on various populations that are more vulnerable. Next slide, please. All right, that concludes our introduction to this topic. I think we're going to go now into our panel presentations, and I will go ahead and get us started with the City of Arlington. So Jinsey Thoppel with the City of Arlington is going to be talking about residential infill and redevelopment housing efforts. Jinsey is the Planning and Development Services Director for the City of Arlington.
Thank you, Sean. I hope everybody can hear me. All right. So this is a project that we started last year, and kind of the pioneers in this region to start a project like this. And so we do have some lessons we've learned that we would like to share with you all. I am the Director for Planning and Development Services Department for City of Arlington. Next slide, please. So there's quite a lot to cover to kind of give you all the process that we followed. So I'll try to go as soon as possible with these slides. The background of it, it's important to know that this project was only started because our city council, during one of their planning sessions, like the council retreats, they brought up the issue about how do we eliminate barriers for infill development, redevelopment, and renovations or additions to older homes. And why we are talking about this in Arlington, just to give you context, is Arlington is almost developed in terms of we only have about 7.6% of our land left for development. So we are right now in that process, in that time frame of doing small infill developments and a lot more redevelopment. So that's where council asked us to focus our attention on, and also create a focus group that can help us with the development of these standards. This was also aligned with our housing goal in our comprehensive plan, which is the 99 square miles, to provide a mix of quality housing for a diverse population. And I wanted to also emphasize that it meets the needs of current and emerging populations. So that was the other thought process that we had. And then in February of 2021, we had a Unity Council report that was published. A Unity Council was created in 2020. It was a 30-member group, very diverse group, sat together and came up with what are the items that City of Arlington needs to tackle in order to provide more unity, equity in the City of Arlington. And one of the committees that that council worked on was housing. And for the housing piece, they had 3 recommendations: establish different standards for infill housing, examine our current ordinance to eliminate barriers to attainable housing, and then develop attainable neighborhoods with accessible services. Next slide, please. So with that in mind, we started right after council direction on April 30. We formed the focus group, selected the specific people from different organizations that council gave us authority to move forward with, and kicked off the project on July 1st. From July to January, almost 6-7 months, we did a lot more of visioning and educational efforts with the focus group. Then met with the council committee to kind of brief them on what has happened till then. And then the focus group started drafting recommendations. So that went on till March of this year. Next slide, please. And then on March 8th, we went back to City Council at their afternoon session and gave a full briefing of what the drafted recommendations were. And that's where Council said, okay, now stop your work there. We need to now go to public, right? And get their we met with different specific groups also, such as Ambassadors for Aging Well, with our Arlington Board of Realtors, and finally went back to council on August 23rd with the full findings of where our public stands with these recommendations. And at that time, after looking at that, the decision was we need to take a pause here. We don't see a full, go forward kind of positive response yet. Need to take a pause, learn more from our citizens, and then revisit this item back in 6 months. So let's go to the next slide, please. So in order to give our public an understanding of what we were looking at, we had to provide some more data. So in 2020, Arlington had commissioned a housing needs assessment, And the biggest takeaway from that was that the projected growth of our senior households over 65 was going to be over 10,000 more with a projected shortfall of senior housing. So we were 10,000 short of that households that we should have by that time. And then also a continued shortfall of 7,000 housing units for our median household income. And if you look at those charts, that's what it will show. The median household income, again, between that 50 to 75,000, just like how it was Travis brought that up. In that range, if you look at it, we were already short on those housing, and we're going to be even more short in another 2 years. Next slide, please. So what Arlington experienced is not something that it's just Arlington. Everywhere in the nation, we are experiencing the same thing, right? It's the housing shortage is a nationwide crisis. The recession of 2008 set that stagnation of new housing development, and then COVID further reduced any opportunities to catch up on that housing count, and so further setting back the number of housing units. Next slide, please. So as I explained before, since we are nearly built out, being deliberate with the remaining development or remaining land that we have is very necessary. The easy lots have already been developed, and what's coming now is going to be more complex and complicated projects. Next slide, please. You already saw what that missing middle housing, just to give a context in Arlington, the housing types that we have on the left-hand side, the pie chart that you see, the single family detached is 62%. We have townhomes and duplexes also, but it's just 4% and 2%. We have 3 to 4 units of triplexes or quadplexes, another 5%. And then when you think about the multifamily piece, that is 27%. So as you can see, our missing middle housing is very small percentage, less than 10% that you can see. Next slide, please. And so these are some of the homes that would fall under the missing middle housing. Dan Perlich, in his book, The Missing Middle, describes them as that those housing types that were common. It was really common in the pre-World War II United States, right? Duplexes, triplexes, townhomes, row houses, but now are less common and missing. And so that's what we're talking about. These are the housing types that are very compatible in scale with single family or the transitional neighborhoods. It's intended to meet the demand for complete walkable neighborhoods. And it responds to our changing demographics and may provide attainable housing at different price points. Next slide, please. So what we try to do through this whole process is differentiate two issues. One issue was more with the development issue that council was trying to brought up in the council retreat. And then the other issue was more of the housing issue that was also addressed with our comprehensive plan as well as the Unity Council. So the development issue, which is examining the existing UDC, stands for Unified Development Code regulations, to remove the barriers for developing hard to develop small residential zoned infill sites. So we showed our public as well as council that for getting any kind of development done on these hard to develop lots, the shape, the site doesn't, the site shape does not help for that, or it has floodplains or whatever be the case. It has to now, right now, the process will be that they will come in for a planned development rezoning. It might take 4 to 5 months. It takes money up front for plans, and then it goes through public hearings, right? So many people are intimidated just by that. And then, so we came up with a recommendation about taking out some of those barriers, those standards that can help relieve some of these standards. So create a slight flexibility, allow about 15% reduction in lot size, living area, setback minimums, and all that could be done administratively without having to go for public hearings. But main thing is without sacrificing the contextual aspect of the neighborhood. Similarly, we don't need to have a lot depth as well as a lot width and lot size requirement. One of it can go away, so remove the lot depth requirement was our suggestion. So this issue did not involve any new housing, introducing any new housing types. It was just really related with development of smaller lots, how that can be done easily. Next slide, please. The second issue, which was the housing issue, was the more complex and contained two pieces where we were trying to allow wider range of quality housing choices and then developing housing attainability options. This is the one that was the most contentious of the considerations that we presented to town hall meetings, and I'll share more about it. Next slide, please. So the public feedback session starts. We had open house, 5 town hall meetings, 1 telephone town hall. Again, this is a good one to note. Telephone town hall works really well. We got about 1,000 people in 1,000 or more in that telephone town hall. And also we presented to several stakeholder group meetings. Next slide, please. So in the open house, one of the things to note is that we got the most one-on-one interaction in an open house because it was not a presentation-oriented event. So it was set up as a come and go. Staff had the ability to answer many questions and gain valuable insight and suggestions from the attendees. So different ways of how to do public engagement. Open house was one of them, and we felt it was very valuable. Next slide, please. This is how it was set up. We had boards there and then and 3 stations so that people can come to any 3 stations and have the same boards. And staff was there on hand to answer any questions. Attendees had opportunity to place sticky notes with their comments on the boards at their leisure. And so there's a lot of dialogue that happens during such sessions. Next slide, please. So with the open house results, you can see, I mean, we typed out a few of those results and a lot of answers were no, we do not need higher density. No, we don't need special zoning for townhomes or duplexes. And there were a few yeses, but very few of them. But as you can see, those were questions on the left-hand side. Consider allowing attached single-family home in single-family detached zoning districts, and that was a big no. And then adding the different types of missing middle housing types in our code. We don't really have that housing type in our code also. And so those were the questions. So next slide, please. And then we had town halls in all 5 council districts, and I'm not going to go through all of these results, but we had sign-in sheets, we had board responses, so we had boards in the town halls too, and then we had online surveys. So SurveyMonkey was used to create the online survey for each and every meeting that we went into, and so we knew the feedback coming from every meeting, what it was through those SurveyMonkey results as well. Next slide, please. So during the whole thing, again, listening to our residents, right? Many attendees expressed concerns regarding number of investor-owned residential properties. So even though we were not really talking about those issues, housing is a much broader issue and every part of it will come into picture. So investor-owned residential properties became one of the big issues. Our seniors mentioned that our housing that we have currently is not designed to meet their needs. So aging in place, that has not been considered. And so we need to look at housing for that specific type as well. And we discuss high-level issues around housing affordability. So as you know, how the housing prices have just gone up. And with the recent interest rate hikes, that affordability factor is just really, really important. How do we make that happen? And many attendees noted that additional housing options were not needed. Were needed, but not in their neighborhoods, right? So they were okay. Yeah, maybe it's needed. You can show the statistical information and it shows that it's needed, but no, not in my neighborhood. So next slide, please. So results I'm going to declare. So next slide. Okay. So we did have an option about how about we create a new mixed residential zoning district. And so this is just a creation of a zoning district, have the standards and everything ready for whenever a development or a developer proposes, we have the standards to go by. So this was received pretty well in one way, but if you look at, again, the consensus of majority was no for this as well. But this was really not designating a space or a location in the city where this would go, but just having a zoning district in place with the standards. Next slide, please. So again, as on the left-hand side, what you see with the capital no is like strong no's is what we got for all of these recommendations, creating the new zoning district, creating another new zoning district called unified mixed residential, that may be a residential that's built to rent, purposefully built to rent. And then another one was allowing redevelopment of larger properties with using this zoning district without having to go through a rezoning. So overwhelming no on all of these. Next slide, please. We talked about additional housing types. Next slide, please. And the results from that was, again, an overwhelming no about allowing duplexes, triplexes, quadplexes in single-family zoning district. Or the next option was maybe not in there, but as long as it is in scale and form to adjacent homes, so it can be outside of these existing neighborhoods. The next option was maybe it's in certain overlay districts. So all of it was a big no. Next slide, please. And then development of attainable housing was the other thing that we were looking at. So secondary living units came about as one great idea to allow for that attainable housing. And we do allow that in Arlington in the larger lot size zoning districts. However, it's not allowed by right in some of the smaller zoning districts, smaller lot size zoning districts. So we require them to go through a specific use permit to get that approval of a secondary living unit. And the recommendation was remove that SUP or the specific use permit requirement. And result of that, next slide, please, was also a no. However, now you can see that capital no's have become smaller no's. So we still got, there were people who said, yes, this is a good idea, but there were still people, a lot more people who said no for all of this. It also included creating a small lot zoning district, which was less than 5,000 square feet, or also the option of allowing smaller home sizes than what we allow today, which is 1,500 square feet. Next slide, please. So then I'll go to the next one. Next slide. Findings wise, next slide again. So summary, so participants did not oppose the idea of providing slight flexibility in the UDC standards for those small infill sites. So these were the two things that we asked. So we asked council if we wanted to move forward with this part, just the first issue, which was the development issue. However, with all the other findings that we had about this whole project, council did not feel comfortable that we proceed with even this development issue at this time. And as they said, let's take a pause and come back in 6 months. So next slide. And the other issue, which was the housing issue, the majority of the participants were not in favor of the proposed housing issue solutions, especially the ones increasing the variety in housing types. Housing attainability was still seen more positively than the variety in housing types. So one thing that I would say here is what we understand is residents are very protective of their established neighborhoods. And again, understand Arlington has several established neighborhoods. And they feel that some of the proposed housing options may negatively impact their neighborhoods. We also learned that the one size fits all, because we were talking about all of these standards happening citywide mostly. So one size fits all approach does not work in this regard. So I'm kind of giving you some of the insights we understood. Everybody wanted to see redevelopment of deteriorating neighborhoods and blighted areas in Arlington, but didn't know this is the way or this is the path for it. Residents were concerned about increase in investor-owned rentals, so timing was also not working for this project. They would like to see more proposals to increase home ownership, which it's perceived as a symbolic of building wealth and future maintenance of neighborhoods. Next slide, please. So with all that, there are still issues that remain to be addressed, right? And this was shared with the council. We really don't have, so Arlington does not have standards for the new housing trends that's emerging that we are seeing it in Arlington. They only have to come through a planned development process, and we have to go through that. So that's the reason we will see more proliferation of planned development cases. So since beginning of 2021, we have already processed 65 planned developments. So that's quite a lot for Arlington at this time. And then the rise of corporate investor-owned properties. And again, I'm 100% sure it's not just Arlington, it's happening everywhere. Over 60,000 of our owner-occupied single-family residential properties we have, and of that, about 16,000 are not actually owner-occupied. So 60,000 are owner-occupied, 16,000 are not owner-occupied. 9,000 have owner addresses, which are outside of Arlington, and 3,000 are out of state. So you're going to see this in your cities as well. And then revitalization of areas that's prime for redevelopment. We do need to come up with what's that strategy going to be. And then aging in place is a big thing for Arlington and for this Metroplex and for Texas. Next slide, please. So Patricia is here on this call as well, and Richard Gertson. All three of us have been working on this project. So if you have any questions on this subject, definitely contact us. Our email addresses are on our department's webpage on that same residential infill redevelopment project icon. So with that, I am available for any questions. Or do you all want to have the questions at the end?
Yeah. Sorry, go ahead. Okay. Yeah, if people can hold their questions to the end, that would be wonderful, but feel free to insert your questions in the chat at any time. And we'll definitely get to those questions at the end of the presentation. Thanks so much, Nancy. That was really interesting. A lot of good insights and lessons learned there. Really appreciate you sharing that.
Thank you.
Our next presentation is going to be on the City of Fort Worth Evans and Rosedale project. Amy Connolly will be joining us to talk about that. She's the Assistant Director of Neighborhood Services Department for the City of Fort Worth, and she specializes in housing and community development.
Good afternoon. Can you all hear me? Yeah, I'm getting nods. Yes, great. Thank you. Thank you for time to talk about this development. This is definitely a proposed missing middle development, but it is not a good example of something that is quick and easy. So I want to take you through the planning effort that has got us to almost breaking ground. We haven't broken ground yet on it, but show you some of the planning background and everything that went into it. And when we show you the time frame, I think you'll all be very surprised, or maybe you won't be surprised. I don't know. So next slide, please. Unless I can do it, I don't think I can do it. Great. So this is an area of the city of Fort Worth that is really adjacent to I-35 and just south of I-30. So it is highway oriented. On the west side of the property is I-35, and so this is at I-35 and Rosedale, and just directly close to that, it's a neighborhood that is called both the Terrell Heights neighborhood, and also this area is called Evans and Rosedale. So just to kind of give you a sense of where it is. Next slide. And this area has been part of Fort Worth for a very, very long time. This picture of Fort Worth from 1891 shows this area in sort of the top left area of the screen. And it has been cut off from the downtown of Fort Worth by railroads at one time. And you can also see this on a map from the 1880s, where it has been platted already in 1880. So it is very near to the downtown. It's compact. It has been here for a very long time. Next slide. But near the turn of the century, of course, just like a lot of our urban areas, this became a neighborhood that was predominantly Black. And you can see from our redlining map that we have here from the 1930s, you can see that this area, and I don't think I can point to it effectively, but it was labeled as hazardous because it was a majority Black neighborhood. This was the neighborhood in which you had the first Black Texas millionaire. This neighborhood had Black doctors and lawyers and professional class in gorgeous homes throughout this neighborhood. And you can also see from this Green Book listing, this listings from the Green Book, that this was also the place where you had restaurants and hotels and rooming homes where Black travelers would stay. So this was, in all intents and purposes, this was the neighborhood that had culture, that had wealth, but was separated from the downtown at the time by railroads. And then eventually, we all know what happened. I-35 came in, I-30 came in and separated this neighborhood, tore down a lot of this neighborhood and separated it from the massive downtown. Next slide. Now, I had been told by many people that this was the neighborhood that had the Jim Hotel, which was the center of Black music in Fort Worth. But it turns out that it was not in this neighborhood. It was actually in downtown, but within walking distance. So they had all kinds of performers there that you would recognize all of them. And this was a place where you could get a room, you could go to the beauty shop, and you could also see some fantastic acts. So I just want to let you know that this neighborhood at one time was where it is at in Fort Worth. Next slide. We're going from the turn of the century then in the 1930s to where it is today. And today, this neighborhood has a lot of vacancy. And we're going to go through some slides just kind of showing you what the Evans and Rosedale commercial district currently looks like. It has been largely demolished. So we're going to go through some slides here. So next slide. You can see there have been some streetscape improvements made, but there's no development here. Yeah, keep going. There's a highway, kind of see it at the back there. So how did we get here? So the Evans and Rosedale project really began as the Evans Avenue commercial revitalization in the early 80s. And how do I know that? This picture, you can tell by the cars. This was the early 80s when we started working on Evans and Rosedale in the city of Fort Worth to revitalize it. Next slide. And here's a general timeline. So the year I graduated from college, the near South Side CDC started issuing a planning document showing the need for economic development in this area. TIF was established in the near South Side and encompassed this area. We had involvement of an economic development action plan that was created by the Fort Worth Metropolitan Black Chamber of Commerce. A vision plan was created in the year 2000 with an advisory committee. The city received EDI grants and $7.5 million of Section 108 loans. And we started acquiring property and demolishing buildings in the 2000s. And so over about a 2-year period, most of the properties in the Evans and Rosedale area were acquired and demolished by the city of Fort Worth. At the same time, we did a streetscape project anticipating that immediately we would have a lot of redevelopment occur. I think this is probably a good example of urban renewal, where we took down a lot of buildings, even some in an historic district, anticipating that there would be development occurring on the heels of that, and it did not occur. We did create 2 public buildings in this area. Chamblee Library was constructed, and it's a beautiful library. And Hazel Harvey Peace Center for Neighborhoods, which is a city building, was also constructed in 2009 using community development block grants. We did some development that was appropriate at the time. Don't necessarily think City of Fort Worth staff would agree that now it would be appropriate, but at the time, the best that we could do was a Jack in the Box and a 7-Eleven at the corner of the highway in order to make something go. And they thought that at the time that would be sort of an incentive project to make more happen there. A hotel development was contemplated in 2016 and 2017 that didn't materialize. And then in 2018, the city issued a request for economic interest, and we had 8 responses. And then 2019, Ho Global out of Dallas was selected as a master developer. So almost 30 years to see this neighborhood finally get redeveloped. Next slide. And just a quick summary, to get there between 1998 and 2015, the city of Fort Worth spent almost $30 million on the redevelopment of this area. And as we'll talk about the incentives for this new development, we're still having to incent to get this developed. So next slide. So in 2005, the city adopted an urban village master plan for this area. And it's Rosedale is on the south, the highway is on the west side of this. And we envisioned a lot of mixed use occurring here. Not a lot of provision for parking that I can see in the plans, but we envisioned at the time, 2005, mixed use was where it was at. And so there was a lot of multifamily structures and mixed use development with commercial on the ground floor and residential on the top floor. And so that is kind of what the plans all surrounded. And you'll see the streetscape that is in there is already in place. And so we anticipated that this would help us spur a lot of redevelopment. Next page. In 2009, Evans and Rosedale area adopted design standards and guidelines, basically putting in some design standards to make sure that whatever development happened here, it would happen in a way that would support the neighborhood redevelopment. So it's important to note that just to the east of this Evans and Rosedale commercial area is a very, it's a single family neighborhood. And so the residents of that single family neighborhood are very active and vocal in wanting to protect the integrity of that neighborhood. And so whatever development we needed to do here at Evans and Rosedale, it really needed to fit with the neighborhood. And so you'll see a lot of the planning for it was the higher, taller buildings, the more intense density was closer to the highway. As you got closer to the residential development, then it diminished in scale and density. Next slide. We polled the neighborhoods extensively in 2018 as an effort to make sure that our RFQ that we issued, or our RFEI, really addressed the needs of the neighborhood. And the neighborhood said, you know, our biggest issue right now is crime. And so we want to see a redevelopment that will help us reduce crime in the neighborhood, improve the appearance of the neighborhood, and have walkability in the form of quality sidewalks and streets. So that they wanted walkable, they wanted something that fit in with the neighborhood, but mostly they were just really wanting to see a redevelopment that would help them reduce crime in the neighborhood. Next slide. And in 2019, the city adopted the Near South Side Form-Based Code, which guides this whole development. And that's pretty exciting to be able to do missing middle development using a form code. You know, this code really helped guide the development and guide the design of the development that the developer has provided to us. And it was easy to follow. It's easy for the developers to see exactly what they need to do, where they need to position the buildings on the lot, and how to get development that addresses the concerns of the neighbors. So I can't say enough great things about the Near South Side Form-Based Code. It was been a lifesaver to getting this neighborhood redeveloped. Next slide. So the RFEI went out in 2018. Responses came back in 2019. We worked with UT Arlington to facilitate a community input workshop in February 2019. The next slide. Again, specific sites included a lot of property that was owned by both the Housing Finance Corporation and the Local Development Corporation. So just to let you know, this is truly a partnership between the Housing Finance Corporation, which I work for, and the Local Development Corporation, which is run by our Economic Development Department. So we are working on this project together because we co-own almost all the lots in this area. Next slide. And Hogue Global was selected as the developer of choice. After going through 8 applications and doing lots of interviews and a very inclusive community process, Hogue was chosen, and they have stayed true to form, continued to meet with the neighborhood, continued to attend their neighborhood meetings, continued to be responsive to the neighbors' needs for redevelopment. So let's see what they're proposing. Next slide. It's a 2-phase, first phase $60 million. Multifamily units and live-work units, 27,000 square feet of retail, some of which is going to be a national, we hope a national chain grocer, parking spaces in a parking garage, enhancements to the park that has existed there and is a really interesting park. And then phase 2 is 20 townhomes that will bring an additional 10 million of capital to the development. Next slide. Look at some plans here. Now I'm showing these north facing so that you can get a sense the highway is over on the left and the residential neighborhood is over on the right. So you can see that the larger development which includes a multifamily development with a parking garage, sort of the Texas donut, with the retail development at the corner that will hopefully be a grocery store. And then it's kind of hard to see this because this is going to be a multi-level building in the middle there between Missouri and Evans, but live work units, as well as some smaller retail buildings with residential above. And then at the very corner of Terrell and Evans Avenue on the top part of that is a neighborhood brewery. We intended to take a existing, very dilapidated building and refurbish it into sort of a neighborhood coffee shop and brewery, but we found that the building's too dilapidated. But we're going to try to do something very similar to that. And then you see phase 2, which is on the east side of Evans Avenue, will eventually be townhomes that will blend in very nicely, we believe, with the single family residential neighborhood directly east. Next slide. And so here's a picture of the development as the developer wants you to see it. So this is situated where north is over on your right-hand side. The highway is up top. The residential neighborhood is to the bottom, and Rosedale is on your left, off screen there. So you can see how this sort of positions in the neighborhood, and that the higher level density, the higher level buildings are closer to the highway, and the 2 to 3 story townhomes, and I think they're going to be 3-story at this point in time, are closer to the residential area. Next slide. I'll flip through some slides here. I'll just have staff go through those if you don't mind and show you some elevation renderings that the developer has proposed. Yeah, so we're really excited about this. The neighborhood is really excited about it as well. We're getting down to trying to help with picking out brick colors, but overall, everyone is very pleased with the site plan and excited to see everything move forward. And so where are we in the development timeline? So next slide. We got hit with a pandemic like everybody else, and I went to go work in a homeless shelter for a little bit, as I'm sure all of other city staff had to do other jobs in between. So we were intending to be done with permitting and financing in December of 22, and that did not happen. We have all our development documents ready to go and to be certified, and we're ready to sell the properties. We just finished a phase 2 environmental for the whole entire site. We anticipate that we will probably be closing on the property and selling the property to the developer, with a lot of our financial incentives tied to that, in March of 23, which is just coming up, and that we will have construction starting probably in April 23. So that's the plan at this time. It's just been a lot harder than we thought because of environmental issues that we found on site there, and just making sure that we were communicating with the neighborhood and being able to move forward. And of course, the rise in interest rates has not helped us at all. Next slide. I want to take you really quickly through the financial incentives, because I know this can be a little bit boring, but I just want to let you know that in order to do missing middle housing, incentives at this point are required in order to make that financially work. And I wish it wasn't that way, but that is the reality in Fort Worth, that in order to do this project in this particular area, it requires some heavy subsidy, and we're happy to do it. We want to do it, and this has been a really fantastic project to work on, but it is going to be something that requires a lot of help from the city. So the developer is investing $60 million in phase 1, another $10 million in phase 2, and they are providing at least 20% of all the residential rental units will be affordable housing, and the affordable housing and economic development is considered to be 80% AMI or lower. 10% of those units will be at or below 60% AMI, and 10% will be below 80% AMI. So we're pretty happy with that. You know, it's unusual for a market rate developer to agree, but that's part of our policy in the city of Fort Worth is when you're doing work and you're using HFC property that you have to have more affordability included. Next slide. And this is, I'm going to go through this really quick, but it's just that we're requiring in our incentive agreement that the developer continually engage with the community, that it's responsive to and informed to historic and cultural context and the development of public spaces, that it will make its best effort to attract a grocer, and that we'll be waiving fees as part of our neighborhood empowerment zone program, and that they're also going to make best effort to acquire one little property in the middle of all of this that has got a holdout owner, and that's already been accomplished. Next slide. And so the city is committing to do a Chapter 380 agreement, which abates personal property taxes, sales tax, real property taxes. It's got an incentive cap of $8 million on the completion of phase 1, and another $1 million would be added if phase 2 is completed. And we've tied all of these grants to meeting certain commitments. So once we have the commitment of the $60 million in, the grant would be paid up to 65% of that grant. We also are requiring that they hire 15% Fort Worth minority contracting, which is fantastic. And we're also requiring that they do their best effort to hire 30 full-time employees in that development, because we want to see jobs for the neighborhood and jobs for Fort Worth residents. And without that, they will withhold 5% of the proceeds of the 380 agreement. So we're really excited about the add-ons that we met, and the neighborhood had requested some of these, and we think it's a good thing too. Next slide. As part of this, we are selling the property to the developer for $1. That's another very large incentive. And the HFC and the LDC will be reimbursing themselves for the sale of this property using ARPA funds. So we haven't lost out on this, and we'll be receiving some funding to allow us to continue to do affordable housing and doing local development in the city of Fort Worth. And so that's going to be a requirement, and there will be some liens on the property to ensure performance. Next slide. I'll just continue to go on. I'm sure we're planners here. Okay, and one more thing, we are spending tax increment on this development as well. We'll be reimbursing up to $7 million of tax increment development, primarily on streetscapes, sidewalks, and redevelopment of a park. The property here, we've got an historic Southside Park here that has the names of many prominent Southside residents and Black leaders in the city of Fort Worth. It's a cherished park for this neighborhood, and we want to make sure that it is continually maintained and that we add to it in ways that assist that development and being a really fantastic place for families. Next slide. And here's our development summary. We've analyzed this all different ways. The payback to the city of Fort Worth and public-private funds in terms of getting payback and tax revenue will be about 10 years. So we're happy with that. Next slide. And we just got some really interesting news. We were able to attract the location for the National Juneteenth Museum. Will be located directly adjacent to this development along Rosedale Avenue, and that is a significant investment in this neighborhood, and we'll be honoring traditions in Fort Worth, as well as Opal Lee, who is one of our dear community leaders and was just recognized as a Nobel Prize nominee. That will be in the neighborhood, and we think that this is going to be a fantastic synergy between the new residential development and commercial development, and then this National Juneteenth Museum located right in the center of this neighborhood. And I think that's all I have for slides. Great, thanks for letting me take up some of your time today. I'm very appreciative.
Thank you so much. That was a really interesting project with some great housing options and a really interesting historical perspective as well. So we really appreciate you taking your time out to share that story with us. We are now going into our final presentation. So we have Dr. Rolf Pendahl from University of Illinois Champaign. He is professor and head of the Department of Urban and Regional Planning. He is going to be talking to us about land use reforms for housing supply. He's done some research in this area. And Rolf, we really appreciate you joining us and taking time out of your, I'm sure, very busy schedule at this time, and sharing your perspectives with us, all of us in the Dallas-Fort Worth region. So thank you for joining us.
I'm happy to be here. Thanks very much for inviting me. Let me grab some water. Could you go to the next slide, please? So this is the outline of my presentation. I'm not going to walk through this step by step. You can hopefully just take a glance at it so that I can get on to the rest of the outline. But before I do that, I want to just draw your attention to the bottom line. Land use reform is a process. It's not an event. And I think both of the presentations that have gone on before me, both Ms. Thoppel and Ms. Connolly, show that that's the case pretty much everywhere. Could you go on to the next slide, please? The research I'm reporting about today is actually part of a study that I conducted as part of a team at the Urban Institute. I wrote the proposal to do this work about 4.5 years ago, before I moved from the Urban Institute to the University of Illinois. The lead author on it is Lydia Lowe. She's still at Urban, along with Eleanor Noble and Diane Levi. And so I want to make sure I credit them, because Lydia's name in particular is first on the report for a good reason. She is the main author here. But it was my idea to get the thing started, and I guess that's one of the reasons why I got the call to be on the panel today. So when I wrote the proposal and we undertook the research, the questions were really about what processes help pass land use reform, and then how does it matter that you have a particular kind of reform when it comes to actually producing housing. We were interested in these questions, or I was, because there's a lot of research about the impact of land use regulations on housing affordability, on segregation, on walkability, and so on. But a lot less research about what it takes to pass them and what makes it work. Next slide, please. So this is the bottom line findings. The first question, how do reforms pass? In both of the case studies we looked at, and I think probably you could say this in the cases we've heard about today, that in order to pass a reform on land use regulations, it really helps a lot to have strong policies and plans in place first. And then it's a gradual process, building on the political support that it takes to pass those policies and plans for housing that encourages, for regulations that encourage or accommodate more housing supply. You build that support in the policy process. Then you have to build and continue building it in the regulation development process. There's trial and error involved. You may get it wrong the first time, and you realize that. And then conditions will change both in the market and politics that make you have to go back to the reform. Could you click, please? And then on the second question, reforms deliver housing when the property owners know about them, when they work financially, when they limit discretionary review as much as possible, when the approval process is clear, and when elected and appointed officials support the goals that the reforms aim to address. So on the next slide, I'll sort of go into how we found out what we did. We found it out with case studies, with a paired case study in between Washington, D.C. and Portland. And why pick those places? Well, it's because both places had reformed in recent years their approach to accessory dwelling units. A lot of other jurisdictions are considering reforms to their ADU laws right now. And that's probably, in fact, the most commonly approached or the most common approach to missing middle housing that we saw. And a lot of jurisdictions in California and some elsewhere have begun this reform process a long time ago of ADUs. So we thought we could learn quite a bit from studying these two cases and see what they told us about what it takes to reform them. Click, please. And DC and Portland offer some useful parallels as cities, not necessarily so much between DC and Portland as in either Arlington or Fort Worth, but I think probably at least some neighborhoods. There has been recent zoning reform in both of those places touching on ADU. Both of them are fast growth cities with serious housing supply constraints. They're both politically progressive, but they also have influential neighborhood defenders who show up to say no to anything new, which sounds pretty familiar from Ms. Thoppel's presentation about the process in Arlington. And they both have constraints in land. They can't annex anything more in their outskirts in either case, and in both places they're pretty well developed. They're not entirely built out yet, which is, it's kind of a contestable concept anyway. So this is why we chose these cases. Take what you will from them in terms of their applicability where you are, but I think the findings will be generally non-controversial and pretty straightforward. Next slide. So here's the DC process, and DC, just to give you a heads up about this, DC it's barely even underway right now, ADUs. But between 1975 and 2000, DC transitioned from not even having control of its own government because Congress was in charge. Through a process of population loss, fiscal crisis. It was under a fiscal control board in the late 1990s. Not until 2001 did the former head of the fiscal control board become the mayor, start a comprehensive planning process. He actually believed, this is Anthony Williams, he believed in comprehensive planning. And it's at that moment that population growth resumes after the long slide. And the city sort of set a goal for itself of having 100,000 new people in the next 15 years. It's on the way to doing that. And of course, as part of doing that, they needed a new comp plan. So it took them 6 years to adopt this new comp plan. The first one, I'm not sure if it's ever, but it's certainly the first significant comp plan that the city's ever done. Click, please. And here's what the plan said about ADUs. And I think the thing to pay attention to with this quote is how wishy-washy it is. Explore changes, but it should be structured to ensure minimal impacts on surrounding uses and neighborhoods. Next slide. But even so, they'd raised it, and they said, well, now that we've raised it, let's think about it when we're redoing the zoning code. But of course, the previous code had not been overhauled since 1958. It was a hot mess. It had been amended over 1,000 times since then, and so then they had to start on the zoning review. Having to write a new code meant that the ADU considerations got wrapped into this whole new code, which had lots of other issues that were quite controversial, including some talk about raising the famous DC height limit, which sent the whole thing into spirals of local politics that are probably worthy of a whole 5-season Netflix series. Ultimately, the new code was finally passed in 2016. Can I have the next slide? And so I'm going to come back to what that had in another minute, but let me talk about how different the Portland process has been. Many of you probably know the roots of planning in Metro Portland. In 1973, the state of Oregon passed a State Growth Management Act, which, among many other things, required cities and counties to develop urban growth boundaries, and it required the cities to do long-term plans for urban growth inside those boundaries. So it was a trade-off between making sure there's enough room to grow inside the boundaries, but also permanent preservation outside the boundaries. In 1981, the state regulatory agency for growth, the LCDC, passed the Metropolitan Portland Housing Rule, which essentially said cities have to make it a lot easier for dense development to happen inside those boundaries. Cities were required to amend their zoning so that they would accommodate an average 6 to 10 dwelling units per acre, depending on the city. Plus, they had to have a 50-50 mix in their zoning of the build out at multi and single family densities. And it also required a more straightforward development approval process so developers could know that they could build there. Otherwise, they were going to have to grow the urban growth boundary to accommodate growth as the law required. So this is the result on the right that you can see. Maybe some of you have been to Portland and you know this scenario where you've got moderate density to even high density development butting up right against the urban growth boundary. Next slide. And over the same period, starting in 1981, Portland, the city of Portland, not the whole metro now, was starting to evolve its ADU policies. In 1981, the city's policies first began allowing ADUs with a lot of the same kinds of controls that we heard about before from Ms. Thoppel, small area, internal, and so on. 10 years later, they codified that in the zoning code, same kind of restrictions. And there were gradual reforms that loosened these things up over a 20-year period. Note, this is a 20-year period here, right? So owner occupancy no longer required in the main house, started to allow garage conversions, allowed the ADUs to be bigger, to be built on smaller lots, and even to be built outside the main unit, which was a big thing. Oh, so can I get a click, please? Can you click, please? Thanks. But in 2010, there's an advocate who was really interested in this missing middle question and more walkable neighborhoods and affordability. And there's still the pressure not to increase the pressure to grow, to expand the urban growth boundary. And so people saw that there were still way too few ADUs built to meet the needs and the goals of the program. And after some study, they said, well, the development costs are just too high. Costs $200,000 to $400,000 to build one of these units. Soft costs could make up 20 to 30% of that. And so they said, well, why don't we take a look at our impact fees, which they call system development charges, which total between $10,000 and $16,000 per unit for the things that are listed here. They looked at the existing ADUs and asked, well, do those really have that impact on our systems? And they said, we don't think so. They adopted a pilot in 2010. They've made more adjustments since then, but essentially they made it formal, made the impact fee waiver formal in the last few years, and that was the regulatory change that we picked up when we did this national scan. Next slide. So here's how they stack up in Portland versus Washington. Owner occupancy requirements in the main unit, no versus yet. Is it by right? Yes, in Portland always, but in Washington it's only for for attached ADUs. You still have to have external special exception review in DC. Is there a minimum lot size in Portland? No, you can build it on any size lot. Now in DC, the minimum lot size has to be either 1,200 or 2,000 square feet, depending on the zone. You know, I will note that this is probably, much smaller than any single family zone anywhere in the Dallas-Fort Worth Metroplex. Square footage limits, really huge difference here. You can be pretty big essentially in Portland as an ADU, as long as you're not larger than 800 square feet. You can share the water and sewer with the existing house, and you have financing incentives in Portland that are not in place in DC. You don't have to have zoning board review. In Portland, you do in Washington for those by right considerations that are mentioned just above. Can you click to the next slide, please? So these two slides show you the differences in the unit production between these two reforms. Drawing your attention here, yeah, they did seem to matter, but look at the axis on the left. The maximum here is about 30 units in DC attained in 2018. The 2019 numbers here are part year results, and that starts in 2010. In Portland, on the right-hand side, you've got a maximum of over 600 units produced starting way back in 1995. But note here that they'd already allowed a lot of these things that that DC had allowed, much earlier than 95. So it was really pretty moribund. It was not very much happening up until 2009 when they adopted this system development charge, and all of a sudden things really zoomed up here. Can you go on? So this comes back to my bottom line conclusions from earlier. I hope that you see what I mean now by the policies and plans come first in Portland, the whole armature state growth management, and then the Portland metro system and Portland city plans. They all came first to build support for the idea of accommodating more housing. In DC, they had the idea embedded in plans, policies, statements, and so on of growing by 100,000 people inside the city limits of the district. And then it's a gradual process that has a lot of things. And, the last bullet on here that wasn't on the first slide, in other places, what you see a lot in these zoning reforms is that you start with an ambitious proposal. The city staff and maybe some elected officials and advocates say, we need to go this far, we need to go this far. And we know we're going to get beat back to this far this time around, but we know it's a gradual process of expanding that box. So that means that the long game really matters. When do reforms matter? Can you click, please? Again, I think you see what the difference between the DC reform and the, at least so far, right, and the Portland reform is that these things matter a whole lot for whether the reforms will actually deliver housing and even stay in place over time. Drawing special attention to that last thing, the elected and appointed officials have to continue supporting the goals that the reforms aim to address. Note, not support the reforms, because they're not going to say, I support ADUs. They're going to say, I support sustaining the urban growth boundary. They're going to say, I support the goal of maintaining our commitment to a DC that's regrowing its population, that has as many people in it as we once did, or maybe not as many, but certainly much more vibrant neighborhoods than we had before. Next slide. So my last slide is really thinking about, well, could I say this generalizes to reforms for other missing middle housing types? And I'd say that the two things that I mentioned on the previous slide are probably necessary conditions. If you have to have the goals and plans, and all of that in place for ADUs, much more so for other kinds of missing middle housing. You'll also require the long game for the missing middle housing types that are pictured on the right here. And just like for ADUs, low cost, predictable approval is going to make or break the implementation in the long run. But you may need even more with larger structure types. You really have to think about where the political coalition will come from to support the triples, the quads, and the small apartments if they're not even showing up for ADUs, which in many cities across the United States, there's a broad enough coalition in favor of ADUs to start getting them passed. They're certainly not going to show up for housing that looks this much different. And I think that's especially true because I'm not sure even most planners realize this, but when the Department of Housing and Urban Development releases its American Housing Survey and their new results that come out every couple of years, they always ask the question on a 1 to 10 scale, where 1 is bad and 10 is great, where would you rate your neighborhood? And the median result on that consistently, when they ask a representative panel of people to say, is 8. So most Americans who live in a house, including even renters, are already pretty happy with the neighborhood they have. That means that, and also they're living in times, more so now than ever, when any changes that they've seen have not made their cities, their states, and their nation much better from their perspective. Things were always better in the past. And so when you come in and you say, we want to change your zoning so that your neighborhood is better, they're like, 1, I doubt that it could get better, and 2, it's more likely that it'll make it worse. And that's why I go back again. I'm a planner. I love plans. You start with the plans and the policies, and you start with the bigger reasons why, instead of saying, wouldn't it be cool if we had a different kind of streetscape here? Okay, that's all I've got for today. Thanks a lot. I hope we have a little time for some conversation now.
Thank you. Well, that was really valuable research, great takeaways that can help inform these issues in our region. So we really appreciate you sharing that with us. And we do have time for discussion, so we're going to go on to our panel discussion now. We have a couple of questions in the chat. We're going to start out with here. Troy Wynn asked, as regional growth increases, property value rises, property taxes, and therefore rents rise. They say we can't build our way out of traffic congestion. What do you see as the best path to build our way out of rising cost and demand? And I think what this question is getting at is how can we manage housing costs as growth demands increase? Would anybody like to take a stab at that question?
Yeah, I guess I would start. All the research suggests that if you don't build enough housing to keep up with demand, your housing prices will go up. The research is a bit more mixed on whether building enough new housing will be enough to actually bring the housing prices down. Housing prices and incomes also have a lot to do with each other. If you have more expensive housing and it's hard to hire people, then you have to pay them more. So that means the incomes go up. But sort of generally speaking, yes, you have to build more. The question is, where are you going to build it? In the past, it's all been at the fringe. And that's how U.S. cities, kept their affordability. And in fact, a lot of places like the neighborhood in Fort Worth that Ms. Connolly talked about, they got emptied out in part because it was so easy to build at the fringe. It might not be so easy to build there at the fringe, any longer in the Metroplex, and the drive is starting to get to be painful. But, I know a lot of pretty remote suburbs that used to be small towns, even when I was a grad student at UT Austin in the late 1980s. A lot of those are now like the centers of cities of 50 to 60,000. So that's still kind of the solution in a lot of the United States. And the housing's getting more expensive for a lot of different reasons that don't have to do with with not enough supply. Not sure that answers the question. But I think focusing on the affordability piece is important. Also focusing on congestion relief. I don't know, a lot of you out there probably, understand that you reduce congestion for a while and then things get congested again. And that, the usual approach to that is, you just widen the roads and you build farther out, which is a self-perpetuating process. I think the thing to stress about missing middle housing is really thinking about what it'll do for accessibility. That is the number of destinations that you can reach in a short period of time, and starting to sort of change the narrative from, do we want to increase mobility, or do we also want to increase the number of places we can go within a 15-minute travel time.
Yeah, I think that's excellent. Those are really, really good insights. Appreciate that.
Well, I just wanted to point out, I know there's a lot of planners from the city of Fort Worth on here that can talk as a sort of a housing department, because we do a lot of housing in Fort Worth. We've found that that where we're most able to do infill development, missing middle housing is actually where there are gentrification issues. So where we have neighborhoods that are changing, vastly changing, and property taxes are increasing to the point where folks can't stay in their houses that they've had in the family for a very long time. That is where we are actually most successful in finding a way to do some, infill development that maybe, address, the local, try to fit it in. Maybe it's not a large scale multifamily development, but maybe it's something, more like townhomes or lower scale affordable multifamily housing. So just saying that sometimes economic conditions kind of have to be to the point where where people are at risk of having to leave their neighborhood sometimes before people will really sort of wake up and say, okay, well, maybe we need accessory dwelling units, and maybe we need other things that will allow us income to keep in our home and keep our kids in the neighborhood too.
I actually had a question about that for you. Can I ask that question? Is that all right?
Sure.
In a lot of the U.S., this kind of an investment in a neighborhood that's predominantly Black, I don't know if it still is, but I assume so. And probably, as Jenny pointed out earlier, there's probably a lot of investor ownership in that neighborhood. I'm just kind of wondering about the potential displacement effects, because I'm sure in a lot of places there would be those concerns. And who is it exactly who's supporting the missing middle housing? Is it the incumbent homeowners? Is it the incumbent renters? Is it the property owners who own the houses that the renters are sitting in, who now may feel like they're in a position to demolish or convert those houses for a higher income clientele?
Well, I mean, luckily for us, we are not doing, all the demolition occurred, 20 years ago. So as part of this particular project, we are not demolishing anything.
Yeah, sorry to clarify, I meant the owners of the properties may now see it in their interest to evict the tenants who are there, demolish the house and put up townhouses or something else. And they may be asking for the code changes and for exactly that reason.
Yeah, we've not seen that. In this particular neighborhood, the housing stock is a lot of historic homes, a lot of homes that are in pretty rough shape. We've actually done a scattered site LIHTC development there about 15 years ago that's getting ready to end its period of affordability. And we've done a lot of investment in that neighborhood to try to keep the housing stock up and keep it performing. I don't know any specifics in this neighborhood about investor owners. I kind of feel like that there's actually a lot of homeowners who have been there multi-generations, and they are very active on the neighborhood association and have been walking alongside with us as we're planning and doing this redevelopment. So, some of the earlier proposals that have been proposed for that neighborhood were rejected. There's probably been, I would say, for this particular development, there's probably been 5 or 6 different site plans that have been looked at and rejected for various reasons, mostly being too dense, too close to the neighborhood.
Yeah, thanks.
Interesting, thank you for that. I'm going to move on to our second question. We've had some discussion in the chat related to early public engagement with people who might be affected or interested in missing middle housing and infill housing. And Lindsay, this is the question for you. Could you talk a little bit more about how we get better public engagement early on and how we can reach those diverse perspectives we need for housing?
Yeah, so what I found is, we did have a whole Unity Council report, and we had a comprehensive plan that talked about these goals. And then we had council support to start thinking about infill developments and what kind of barriers we have in the code to kind of make changes to those regulations, right? At that time itself, these are good policies that we have, but we still need to check the pulse of the community is what I feel that needed to have happened. That's the first step. And when we say pulse of the community, what we found that people were not ready with all these new housing types yet. However, now, as I also said, there were a few things in that whole presentation and the recommendations there where we felt that the negative response was lower than some other types of recommendations. One was that aging in place. We are seeing a lot of senior households in Arlington now. So 10,000 more in 4 or 5 years time frame. that's a lot to say about our demographics. And that's probably where we saw that people were kind of okay thinking about smaller sized homes where they could downsize to. They were okay with thinking about those homes having those features for when they age, that they could age in place. So taking those points from people, that's trying to find the pulse of the community, right? So, and they always said quality, quality, quality. So did you need to keep it as a quality neighborhood? But what are the elements that they are completely not okay with, but at this time, because things can change, right? As Dr. Pendahl also said, you know, it changes with time. And Amy also brought up, every process takes a long time. So within the next 5 or 10 years, there may be a little different opinion that we may see about certain things. So we saw redevelopment was something. So if any of our efforts were targeted to a certain area that was ripe for redevelopment, maybe there was more opportunity to create such a neighborhood, a walkable neighborhood, become like a pilot project that people could see what this is, because we don't have that now. And so how can we get people to see what it is like? So I think, again, finding out the right balance of what our community needs at this time and providing, making changes in the regulations, baby steps to get where we need to be.
Excellent, thank you. Yeah, it's a little bit of that chicken and egg problem there that you're dealing with.
Yeah.
Okay, and I want to remind people too, if you have any questions, go ahead and put those in the chat, or feel free to raise your hand and we'll call you anytime. A couple more questions for you all. I want to ask what do you see as kind of the greatest challenge overall to advancing missing middle housing in cities?
I would say it's people who live in single family houses who don't want their neighborhoods to change. And those people often look really different from the people who need the new housing. And that, to me, is why it's really important to build a narrative about how our neighborhoods are changing and how problematic it is for society as a whole that we have so many neighborhoods that aren't adapted for new kinds of families, for new people. I think, you know, this is going to sound controversial, and I'm sorry, but I'm going to say it anyway. I think the whole idea that the way that we get these problems solved is just by involving more people and asking more low-income people and people of color and renters to show up at meetings or what their opinion is. You know, when we have a responsibility as professionals, according to the AICP code, to do what we can to do at least two things. One, think about the long-term picture and the interrelatedness of decisions, but also to think about the social justice concerns that we have. And so, you know, does that mean that we just need to bring more people in if we know that it's going to be a losing battle? Or does it mean to think about the processes and the politics that we're involved in already, where we can form new coalitions and have the people who may not represent a huge number, but who are going to be the best voices for that long-term view? There are groups, you know, coming up all over the place, these YIMBY kinds of organizations that can be really effective at the grassroots to get people together, to go to meetings, to make arguments to city councils that may not represent enough voters for the city council to change their minds right now, but they may over time do so. And planners have the power to reach out to those groups and to allow them spaces and voices at the table. So I guess maybe I'm speaking out of both sides of my mouth, because you do want to have participation, but that participation, to me, it's going to work best when there are actually, when you have a theory of change that says, I am a political animal here, and I want to make sure that the long-term view that my code calls me to pay attention to is represented in the political process in ways that aren't just asking people their opinion.
I can also add some things here. I felt through this whole process that the one size fits all approach for an entire city, such as Arlington, which is 99 square miles, is not going to work. And it may have to be, we may have to look at it as a small area plan, you know, so when we are going for a neighborhood planning effort or something like that, get down to a smaller area that we are talking about, so we can actually get more engagement from all residents of that area, and then get their buy-in on that. When we go with such a complex issue to a whole, 400,000 population, and try to gauge their viewpoints, it's very difficult, and the whole thing can be just shot down because of the dislike of one thing that can overshadow every recommendation that comes out. So it might be better to start off with a smaller area and an area that, is even ripe for redevelopment or something.
Yeah, it's those baby steps again, and then getting something successful under your belt that you can point to.
I'd also observe that in across the United States, there may be some uncomfortable bedfellows if we're really interested in these kinds of changes. But libertarian groups are really interested in reducing the complexity and difficulty of land use regulations. And from what I recall, there are a few pretty strong libertarians out there in the Lone Star State. So thinking about what the state ledge looks like and how it might treat these kinds of issues without completely opening up cans of worms that planners don't want opened up, that's how most states like California and even now Oregon make progress at the local level. They just say, you can't say no to this kind of thing. And ultimately, of course, that gets into core voting groups who support exclusion from their neighborhoods, who might be too hard to give up for the people who are in control in the state house, whether in California or in Texas. But that's, to me, this is an interesting issue in part because it potentially makes for those weird political alliances that could really change things at the state and maybe even at the local level.
Yeah, that's a very good point. Thank you. Thank you to everybody. This has been a very valuable and insightful discussion. We appreciate your participation in this and joining us as speakers. Thanks again for taking time out to do that today. We're going to wrap up and move on to our announcements. We've just got a few minutes to do that, so I'm going to pass it on to Travis.
Hey everyone. So just a couple of quick announcements. Thanks everyone for joining that panel discussion. Catherine just posted some feedback options there too, so you can give us feedback on our task force. Quick announcement, just shifting gears. Maybe you heard, maybe you didn't. The region has been awarded a $25 million federal grant as part of the Rebuilding America's Infrastructure with Sustainability and Equity for a project on the DART Blue Line in South Dallas in the East Oak Cliff part of Dallas. We'll be building over 30 miles of missing sidewalks, extending the Cedar Crest Trail by 1.5 miles, as well as enhancing some of the DART transit services in that area. So if you're a city out there who's looking to build some large infrastructure projects, at least $25 million in value, and you'd like to look at a federal award, they do these every year. They used to be called Tiger, used to be called Build, now they're called RAISE. Different acronyms will be open to assisting in applications potentially, and like this one, hopefully be successful in bringing more federal funding to the region to build these things. So if you're curious about this particular project, feel free to reach out to me. And of course, we did a previous, I'd like to emphasize the work of planning here. I don't think we would have got this grant award if we hadn't been planning for improving sidewalks around our rail stations for really years before we filled this out. So keep up the effort to plan for improvements, and eventually we can get those into a funded grant potentially. All right, so I think next is Julie with us on
Yes.
here. Hey, Julie.
Hello,
All right, so I'll turn it
everybody.
over to her to talk about another grant.
Yeah, hi y'all. I'm Julie Anderson. I also work at the COG doing on our active transportation team. So Sydney, if you just want to go to our next slide, I'm also talking about our federal grants. So real quick, there's a bipartisan infrastructure law, which has several grants as part of it. And the one I'm going to talk about today is what's called the Safe Streets and Roads for All, or SS4A for short. You can see there's a lot more going on that COG has been involved in or funding, or submitting for, already funded, already submitted for. So here's this one that I'm talking about. If you want to go to the next slide. Real quick, there's a lot of money available. It's a brand new program. It's an 80-20 cost sharing program, and anybody that's an MPO or city, a town, tribal government is allowed to submit for this. And we submitted our application back on September 15th, so we're kind of giving you guys just an FYI that we had submitted this. So next slide. The purpose of this program is really very safety focused. They want to improve roadways by reducing or eliminating roadway fatalities. So the application that you submit for the program really has to promote safety, have low cost, high impact strategies, it has to have equitable investment, and it really has to align with the USDOT's priorities for equity, climate sustainability, job creation, and then economic strength and global competitiveness. So next slide, please. So there were two different grant opportunities under this, so an action grant and an implementation grant. Here at COG, we submitted under the implementation grant. Based on we already have an existing action plan. Our regional pedestrian safety action plan was adopted back in 2020 last summer. And so this plan is really focused on addressing pedestrian safety corridors that were highlighted in the plan through some rigorous analysis, and then also implementing safety countermeasures. And then they also have to be able to advance strategic corridors for future opportunities. So in the plan itself, we highlighted various corridors that can be studied even more, which lines up with this grant opportunity that we submitted for. So next slide. So the project that we submitted was in South Dallas on MLK Jr. Boulevard and Cedar Crest Boulevard. So this is the road that leads right up to Fair Park. So this project submitted for doing a complete street and context-sensitive design of this roadway, also upgrading the DART shelters to smart shelters, and then other various technology upgrades, such as adding Wi-Fi to new streetlights and having more better technology in. Sorry, my words are failing me today. I got my flu shot. I feel like my brain's not working. At the intersections, like traffic signal technology as well. Next slide, please. So here was our schedule for this. You can see it was released way back in May, and we provided this information to our committees here. And then we did submit this application back on September 15th. So we expect to hear about this award either at the end of this year or the beginning of 2023. And we hope to get awarded to just keep our streak of winning alive. We just got the RAISE grant, so hoping we get this one as well. Thank you, everybody.
All right, so I think that concludes our announcements for today. That concludes our meeting. Please help us improve our land use task force meetings by filling out our survey opportunities on this. And you're, of course, welcome to contact myself or Sean or even Sydney or Catherine to provide information on potential things you'd like to speak about at the task force. And as a reminder, we'll be posting the material from this meeting on our website that has been posted into the chat. And as Catherine's reminding us in the chat, you can get AICP credits for this meeting. So please take advantage of that. And we look forward to seeing you soon on our next task force meeting in 2023. Alrighty. Thanks, everyone.
Thank you.